Good evening. Welcome to the 2022 Ryerson Lecture. The Ryerson Lectures are named in honor of Nora and Edward Ryerson and their many contributions to the university. The Ryerson name is one that has been deeply associated with the university since our earliest days. Edward L. Ryerson served on the Board of Trustees for almost 50 years and was chairman of the board from 1953 to 1956. Nora Butler Ryerson was a founding member of the Women's Board and actively involved in the life of the university. The Ryerson Lectures were created in 1972 by the Board of Trustees as a means of honoring our faculty and the incredible breadth of scholarship that takes place across the university. The lectures play an important role in deepening ties across the community and bringing us together to celebrate the spirit of intellectual curiosity and engagement that William Rainey Harper envisaged at our founding. Each year, a committee of faculty members selects the Ryerson Lecturer, a member of our faculty whose scholarship and research have reached a point of lasting value and significance, and whose lecture will be of interest and benefit to the university community. The inaugural Ryerson Lecture was given by John Hope Franklin in 1974. Since then, we have gathered a remarkable roster of names. Subramanian Chandrasekhar, John Simpson, Gary Becker, Martha Nussbaum, and many, many more. The Ryerson Lectures reflect 50 years of our intellectual history, culture, and values. This year, we are adding another distinguished name to that list. We're welcoming Kathy J. Cohen as the 2022 Ryerson Lecturer. Kathy Cohen is the David and Mary Winton Green Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Political Science. She has served in leadership positions at the university, including chair of the Department of Political Science, director of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, and deputy provost for graduate education. Her work lies at the intersection of race, class, politics, and sexuality, and recognizes many of the most complex challenges we face as a society. These include challenges in public education, gun violence, mass incarceration, and immigration, and how those disproportionately affect Black and Latinx youth. Her research is supported by the Ford and MacArthur Foundations, and she investigates the ways in which race and ethnicity shape the experiences of those individuals and communities and how they think about the world. She is the founder and principal investigator of two major public-facing projects, the Black Youth Project and the Gen Forward Survey. Her latest project, which builds on the Black Youth Project, seeks to determine the degree and intensity of political alienation and vulnerability across the Gen X and millennial portion of the population in an attempt to understand what lies at the heart of this country's political malaise. Professor Cohen is the author of two books, The Boundaries of Blackness, AIDS and the Breakdown of Black Politics, and Democracy Remixed: Black Youth and the Future of American Politics. She served as co-editor of Women Transforming Politics, an alternative reader, and as co-editor of the Oxford University Press book series, Transgressing Boundaries: Studies in Black Politics and Black Communities. A member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Professor Cohen is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Haynes Walton Jr. Career Award in 2021, the Robert Wood Johnson Investigators Award, the Robert Wood Johnson Scholars in Health Policy Research Fellowship, and the Andrew Carnegie Fellowship. She was also named a Freedom Scholar by the Marguerite Casey Foundation in 2021. The Ryerson Lecture Committee noted that Professor Cohen's groundbreaking work has been influential in thinking about how to approach questions of inequality and disparity, and the need for a variety of ways to elicit the voices of those left on the outside. Professor Cohen's work is emblematic of what we might think of as an engaged University of Chicago. Her work demonstrates the value of connecting research with the public and working together to understand some of the greatest challenges of our time. The questions she raises are important and timely, and I'm so pleased that we're going to have an opportunity to hear more about her research. The title of her lecture is Democratic Futures: Race, Resistance, and Political Vulnerability. Please join me again in introducing this year's Ryerson Lecture, Kathy J. Cohen.
Come on. Okay. All right. You are keeping us from the wine, so enough of that. All right, I want to thank the President for that very generous introduction, as well as my Dean, Amanda Woodward, Provost Lee, and members of the Ryerson Committee for the invitation to speak this afternoon. I also want to extend my deepest gratitude to all those who put in labor to help organize this year's Ryerson Talk, including my friends in the AV back there, but especially Carol Walensky, who has been my point of contact and a great support. Thank you, Carol. I want to thank my partner, Beth Ritchie, and our daughter, Ella Cohen Ritchie, and really dear friends and family who took time out of their very busy schedules to come out on a very wet day to show their support for me. Similarly, I want to acknowledge the help I received from members of the Gen Forward survey team in pulling some of the data that I'm going to share together this evening, including Matt Nelson and Lane Friedman. And of course, never last, but sometimes least, I want to thank my colleagues, students, and staff across the university, and especially in political science, the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, and our new Department of Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity for their support. Yay to that, the new department. Now, it seems only appropriate that a talk on vulnerability start by demonstrating just such a characteristic. So let me reveal that while I am honored to be giving this talk, I will be especially joyful when it is over. Now, of course, all talks bring with them some anxiety, but preparing for this event has been especially anxiety-producing, and I know my family can attest to that. I am cognizant of the fact that the brilliant John Hope Franklin, a pioneer in the study of African-American history, gave the inaugural lecture in 1974. And I believe, someone correct me if I'm wrong, and I hope I'm wrong, that I am the first Black woman to be honored with this opportunity to deliver this lecture. I mention this not out of hubris, but to remember that I bring with me into this room many African American staff, students, faculty, and community members who have contributed to this university without fully being seen or acknowledged. Now, my talk this afternoon, as the President told us, is entitled Democratic Futures, Race, Resistance, and Political Vulnerability. Throughout this lecture, I will focus on young Black adults and their relationship to democracy. Specifically, I want to borrow from and build on W.E.B. Du Bois, who asked in his canonical text, The Souls of Black Folk, what does it feel like to be a problem? This is a question that has framed much of the social science research and the study of Blackness, as well as Black activist struggles. Very good, thank you, Anna. Today, I want us to contemplate the question, what does it feel like to be a vulnerable subject in a vulnerable democracy? In this rendition of Du Bois's original question, I'm focused not only on the vulnerability of the subject, in this case, young Black adults, but also their placement in a democratic system that I believe Du Bois would agree is itself a problem, that is itself vulnerable. Now, answering the question, what does it mean to be a vulnerable subject in a vulnerable democracy, not only demands that we understand the conditions of vulnerability that, in this case, young Black people face, it requires also that we delineate the expansive nature of vulnerability in the democracy. And finally, it compels us to understand what might be possible or generative in this space of political vulnerability. So today, my talk will be taken up in 3 sections, we'll call it. First, very briefly, I want to say a few words about how the research I have pursued over my career led me to the topic of vulnerability, or actually reveals that I've been studying vulnerability all the time. This section is really meant to kind of introduce my research to those in the audience who may not know my work, who are wondering, like, why am I here? Who is this person speaking, right? You'll learn a little bit more about my research. In the second section, I will discuss the conflicting understanding of what constitutes the crisis or vulnerability of U.S. democracy today. And finally, in the third section of this talk, I will explore what I call the alienated vulnerability of young Black adults and how that shows up empirically. I should note that in this section, the data I discuss is coming from the Gen Forward survey. So this afternoon, I'm interested in exploring what happens to our thinking, to our writing, and to our actions related to democracy when we center young Black people as the normative democratic subject, as opposed to the problem. How does this recentering change how we understand the state? How does it change our kind of perceived attachments to a knowledge of democracy? And the means through which, in fact, change will occur. Okay, so let's start with section 1, my path to the study of vulnerability. Everybody okay? You're so quiet. You're right? Yeah, okay. I didn't know if you'd like, okay. No, you don't have to clap. You don't have to clap. I just need you to know you're breathing still. Okay. I'm breathing now, so we're both okay. I was a graduate student in the late 1980s and early 90s when the ravages of the AIDS epidemic cemented itself as a part of our reality and began to become a part of the national landscape. As we know, the embrace of HIV and AIDS as a political issue and its acknowledgement in affected communities was, to say the least, uneven. Many different segments in Black communities were impacted by HIV, but Black gay men faced what I labeled secondary marginalization, a denial of dominant resources, and a secondary exclusion from traditional sources of support and political power in Black communities, based on their construction as existing outside the boundaries of respectable Blackness. Black gay men were dying, and it seemed like nobody other than their families, biological and chosen, seemed to care. There was a struggle within Black communities and within health and policy circles about whose lives mattered. It was a crisis that touched me very deeply. I knew the names and can still see the faces of young Black gay men who, because of their political and corporal vulnerability, we lost far too soon. People like Essex Hemphill, Assata Saint, and Craig Harris. They mattered to me and the communities and networks I was a part of, so they and the Black politics that failed them became the focus of my research. That research was in conversation with the work of scholars such as Michael Dawson and William Julius Wilson, who were interrogating the limits of class and race in shaping the politics of Black people. I, however, was interested in what would later be the title of my first book, namely The Boundaries of Blackness. Under what circumstances would the consensus issues represented as impacting all those in Black communities give way to the intersecting identities and cross-cutting agendas, often disproportionately impacting those most marginal and vulnerable in Black communities? Moreover, how do those on the margins push their issues onto the main agenda, or what Black feminist scholar Bell Hooks described as moving from margin to center? It is clear to me now that I began my academic career wrestling with the issue of Black vulnerability in the lives of Black gay men who confronted not only exclusion, but also death. And yet, out of their vulnerability, they built generative possibilities for community, for care, and for survival. Looking back on my work, I have come to understand that I have always been concerned with the politics of vulnerability. Whether it was my writing on deviance as resistance, or the radical potential of queer politics, it seems I have consistently been pursuing liberatory frameworks from the beautiful margins of Blackness. And so it made sense after The Boundaries of Blackness that my next extensive research project would focus on the truncated life chances and vulnerability of young Black people in the United States. And yes, this too was personal. My nieces, nephews, cousins, and siblings in the Midwest Rust Belt city of Toledo, Ohio, where I grew up, were and are struggling. They too were vulnerable, economically and physically. And while from a distance they were made to be invisible or monolithic, flattened into unrecognizable stereotypes, presented as communities to be feared, marginalized, and contained, up close, they built vibrant, resourceful, and yes, vulnerable communities, full of struggle, but also full of joy, deep connection, and love. I wrote Democracy Remix, my second book, to tease out and foreground the complexity of young Black people, their contradictions and challenges, personally and politically. In the book, I tried to detail what these young citizens wanted, what they believed, how they felt others saw them, and what they hoped for in the future. I wanted to understand what it meant to come into adulthood with the growth of the carceral state that emerged as one of the only repositories for their dreams and aspirations. That book, too, I now recognize, was about living as a vulnerable subject under carceral control in a vulnerable democracy. In 2009, 1 year after into the first term of the nation's first Black president, we launched the Black Youth Project as a research project and digital platform that sought to amplify the voices and opinions of the young Black people I had written about in Democracy Remix. The BYP was a vibrant space for debate, dialogue, and creative imagining, part of what was emerging as a kind of digital, Black digital public sphere. And 4 years into the BYP, we decided to host a convening of 100 young Black activists. As a host and observer at the convening, I listened quietly to all the plans and projects of these young activists and all the things they hoped to do. And then reality crashed in, when on the second day of the gathering, the George Zimmerman verdict and the Trayvon Martin murder was announced. What had been a confident, forward-looking experiment in Black youth abolition democracy, something that I'll return to, shifted at that moment of the acquittal to a mood of uncertainty, precarity, anger, and yes, vulnerability. In some ways, the verdict was, of course, not a surprise. Black people have been killed with impunity for centuries. But for this generation, what Elizabeth Alexander calls the Trayvon generation, this case was a jolt. Most of the young activists at the gathering had come of political age in the Obama era. And even though they knew the history of Jim Crow segregation, currently lived under the shadow of the prison industrial complex, and understood the limits of the presidency to impact their lives, they hoped that possibly the nation had turned a corner. Interestingly, in that moment of existential vulnerability, these young activists decided to form a new organization, the BYP 100, an organization that would go on to help lead the movement popularly recognized as the Black Lives Matter movement. I watched these young activists turn their political vulnerability into a generative resistance. Now, I want to show you 1 minute of the statement these young people wrote and delivered in response to the Zimmerman verdict, because in this very short snippet, they articulate what I'm going to try to do in 45 minutes, right? Which is they articulate their vulnerability, the vulnerability of the democracy, and the generative potential of vulnerability, suggesting that they will turn their pain into power. Let's take a look.
To the family of Brother Trayvon Martin and to the Black community, may this statement find us in the spirit of peace and solidarity. We know that justice for Black life is justice for humanity. Our hope in community was shaken through a system that is supposed to be built on freedom and justice for all. We are all your sons and daughters. We are the marginalized and disenfranchised. We are 100 next generation leaders. We are the Black Youth Project Beyond November movement. We see the hopelessness of a generation that has been broken trying to find its place in this world. We understand that we need to turn anger into action and pain into power.
As we waited to hear the verdict in the
Thank you. Like those young activists, I am clear that Black people have always been the vulnerable subjects in a vulnerable democracy. American democracy has always been fraught, fragile, and precarious when it comes to Black people. Life itself for many young people, many young Black people, not only in this city, but literally in the neighborhoods that surround this campus, is not promised. And this is not simply a matter of race, but one of race as it intersects with other critical positionalities, such as class, gender, sexuality, and geography. For example, the Black victims of police and vigilante violence in the United States are not just Black people, but most often poor Black people. And it has been these experiences, along with many others, that has facilitated my thinking and brought me to this moment of foregrounding vulnerability in my research. So allow me to think out loud with you about Black vulnerability, U.S. democracy, and how they are related to one another in section 2 of the talk. All right. So we are told by politicians, political pundits, and scholars that the country faces a crisis of democracy catalyzed from factors such as disinformation, political polarization, and the distortion of democratic institutions. Numerous books, articles, and reports have been published about the impending demise of U.S. democracy. And in many of these texts, like that by political scientists Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, authors of the bestseller, How Democracies Die, there is a deep concern that the traditional guardrails of democracy, such as adherence to and respect for the Constitution, an attitude of mutual toleration, and the practice of forbearance have been under assault in recent years. They argue, especially during the Trump administration, threatening the health and, dare I say, survival of the democracy. And while I too agree that U.S. democracy seems yet again especially vulnerable, what keeps me up at night is not only the threat posed by autocratic populist leaders or the image of the Capitol ransacked by insurrectionists, but also the video of the execution of George Floyd. I'm haunted by the cavalier expression on the face of Derek Chauvin, with his hands in his pockets and his sunglasses pulled back on his head as his knee presses the life out of George Floyd. As has been reported, Mr. Floyd told his state-authorized killers more than 20 times that he could not breathe. Eventually, all he could do was call out for his mother as the life was literally squeezed out of his vulnerable body. Of course, there are no video or audio recordings to tell the full story of Breonna Taylor's death in Louisville, Kentucky. It has been reported that Ms. Taylor was alive after being shot 8 times by the police. We are left to wonder how she made sense of officers bursting through her door, executing a no-knock warrant for someone already in police custody. What were the last looks Ms. Taylor exchanged with her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, as she tried to figure out what was going on? Like Mr. Floyd, might she have, with difficulty, whispered that she could not breathe? Or like Mr. Floyd, did she call out to her mother, hoping for some tender reprieve from the pain of dying after her vulnerable body was riddled with bullets? It may seem strange to some to focus a lecture on democratic futures with an extended discussion of vulnerability and Black death. But for me, as a scholar of Black politics, especially one who studies the politics of young Black adults, vulnerability and death is the way I have come to understand threats to democracy and its future. By Black death, I do not mean only the public spectacles of violent policing by state-sanctioned officers and wannabe vigilantes, captured increasingly on cell phone video that ends with the brutal murder of yet another Black person. I mean also, and probably especially, the systemic killing of Black people in disproportionate numbers that is routinely made evident in public health crises such as the coronavirus pandemic and the HIV/AIDS epidemic. I learned from my early work on HIV that in moments of outbreak, such as during pandemics, the veil is pulled back and we see again the uneven distribution of coveted resources such as housing, healthcare, wealth, and education, and how such inequality and insecurity leads to disproportionate death in Black communities. Thus, for me, there is no interrogation, no saving, no repairing or reimagining democracy that does not include centering the vulnerability of young Black people and their relationship to democracy and death. For scholars such as Levitsky and Ziblatt, it is the death of democracy, not the death of any specific group of democratic citizens or participants, that has generated such concern. And while Levitsky and Ziblatt write that, quote, the norms that would later serve as a foundation for American democracy emerged out of a profoundly undemocratic arrangement, racial exclusion, and the consolidation of single-party rule in the South, theirs is actually still a story of rebirth, with American democracy once again establishing guardrails that would push back against its own vulnerability. However, left unattended in their account and many others of American democracy are how the history of slavery, the white supremacist legacy of Jim Crow, and the current era of mass criminalization and the present industrial complex imperils any claim to have a fully functioning democracy in the United States. These are systems of oppression that Professor Saidiya Hartman so aptly calls the afterlife of slavery. She writes, and I quote, "This is the afterlife of slavery. Skewed life chances, limited access to health and education, premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment," end quote. What Hartman, I think, brings into focus is this question: what is the fundamental crisis this vulnerable democracy faces? Is it a threat to the functioning of a system of governance that Levitsky and Ziblatt define as, quote, government with regular, free, and fair elections, in which all adult citizens have the right to vote and possess basic civil liberties, such as freedom of speech and association, end quote? Is it that democracy seems to function even though significant numbers of its citizens continue to suffer from systemic racism and inequality, unable to fully participate in or benefit from it? Or is it that there is no U.S. democracy without the vulnerability and death of Black people? The significance of this juxtaposition of analyses, I believe, is that it substantially alters what we think must or could be done to save, strengthen, or reimagine this vulnerable democracy. And so it is in the intersection of Hartman's afterlife of slavery and Levitsky and Ziblatt's concern with the vulnerability of democracy that I want to center young Black people as our normative democratic subjects. Because who we center determines if we will see and interrogate the liberal state or the carceral state. Who we center determines if we push beyond formal citizenship to investigate feelings of belonging when thinking about the vulnerability of U.S. democracy. And who we center shapes how we understand what is needed and what is possible if we hope to reimagine and transform this vulnerable democracy. Now here I want to make note of the work of my brilliant colleague, Margaret Beale Spencer, and specifically her work on vulnerability and resilience of Black youth through a developmental perspective, or PVES. I aim, not tonight, but in the larger book project, to engage Professor Spencer's work, as well as several feminist theorists who are troubling our understanding of vulnerability and its generative potential. For example, feminist political theorist Iwat Zurek reminds us that, quote, in feminist and anti-racist struggle, vulnerability is intertwined, first of all, with subjection to racist and sexist violence, with bodily injury and extreme destitutions. In other words, it signifies the damaging and indeed disastrous effects of domination and power. Yet vulnerability also has a positive meaning. It can be reclaimed as a condition of intersubjective freedom, action, and political engagement. Similarly, feminist legal scholar Martha Feynman argues that, quote, the vulnerable subject must replace the autonomous and independent subject asserted in the liberal tradition. Far more representative of actual lived experience and the human condition, the vulnerable subject should be at the center of our political and theoretical endeavors. The vision of the state that would emerge in such engagement would be both responsive to and responsible for the vulnerable subject, a reimagining that is essential if we are to attain a more equal society than currently exists in the United States. So if we can understand young Black Americans as the vulnerable subjects that Feynman points to, it reminds us that explorations of citizenship cannot be divorced from engagements with the racial order, white supremacy, and racial capitalism when thinking about the crisis or vulnerability of democracy. And just as importantly for me this afternoon, centering young Black adults in my thinking about democracy means linking their vulnerability to the vulnerability of democracy, not only as a means of critique, but also as a generative space of possibility. So for me, it's in the lives of young Black adults that I find a prompt to explore what feminist scholars writing in an edited volume entitled Vulnerability in Resistance suggests is a reconsideration of vulnerability in light of resistance. What does it tell us about the possibility of resistance? Okay, it's time to turn to the third and final section. Everybody still with me? Okay. I wish I could offer you all water, but I can't. Okay, in this final section, I want to pivot a bit and do what I love doing, share some data coming out of our Gen Forward survey to kind of empirically, I think, outline the reality of being a vulnerable subject in a vulnerable democracy. As some of you undoubtedly know, I have been studying the politics of young adults, specifically millennials and Gen Zers, for over 15 years now. They stay millennials and Gen Zers, I get older. Millennials are now the largest generation, larger than baby boomers. They comprise the largest share of the workforce and eligible voters. Millennials and Gen Zers are more formally educated, with more holding BA degrees compared to earlier generations at this point in their lifespan. And although they seem to be receiving less of a return on this investment in higher education than previous generations, Anne Helen Peterson reminds us that, quote, the net worth of millennials, according to a 2018 study commissioned by the Federal Reserve, is 20% lower than that of baby boomers at the same point in their lives. More fundamentally, the young people at the center of my research grew up after neoliberalism had anchored its project of restructuring the economy. These are generations that have experienced the narration and reality of globalization, where national political institutions have less control over their economic futures. Thus, increasingly, many scholars rightly focus their attention on the precarity experienced by both millennials and Gen Zers. We should remember, nice job, AV. We should remember that many of these young people came of age at a time when the job market was disrupted by the Great Recession of 2008, and they are now experiencing a second disruption, this time related to COVID. So many of the young people I study have been relegated, often against their wishes, to what has been labeled the gig economy, where they piece together jobs, often without benefits, to make a living. Moreover, millennials, especially those of color, are carrying more debt, in particular student debt, than previous generations. African Americans also have less wealth than whites in every generation, but Black millennials have far less wealth than their white contemporaries, with white millennials registering 19 times the wealth than that controlled by Black millennials. We also know they are a generation that is less likely to own a home than previous generations at this point in the lifespan, and possibly most severely, millennials in particular may be the first generation in contemporary economic history to do worse than their parents. But it is not only their economic experiences that make these generations, right, such important subjects of study. It is also the racial evolution and racialized battles in this country that they have witnessed and represent. And it has been through such battles that African American young adults have been reminded of their physical and political vulnerability. Nathan Reimer, a graduate student in the sociology department at the University of Chicago and former member of the Gen Forward team, writes, and I'm going to quote Nathan, that through their cell phones, laptops, and tablets, young Black Americans are reminded daily of their tenuous place in this democracy, as videos of the killing and harassment of Black people, often Black millennials, appear on their favorite digital platform, end quote. Nathan and I would say the Gen Forward team call such images and narrations of Black vulnerability a perpetual racial crisis. Now, we define perpetual racial crisis as, quote, reoccurring public, collective traumatic events that heighten public perceptions of racial inequality, end quote. Perpetual racial crises are not brief and commonplace like microaggressions, but seismic and traumatic. We argue that the collective impact of perpetual racial crises hinge on both the mass distribution of event-related coverage, often across digital platforms, and a sense of solidarity amongst the affected community. Thus, through identification with a particular community, imagined or otherwise, individuals come to feel an allegiance to the community and its members, and consequently a sense of what political scientist Michael Dawson has called linked fate, or maybe I'll talk about it as linked or group vulnerability. Thus, events such as the executions of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor are injustices visited not only upon those who experience them firsthand, but also upon larger Black communities who have secondhand exposure to these traumatic events. For this generation of young Black people, these deathly events, often at the hands of the police, are what my generation would call their Rodney King moment, or what my mother's generation would have termed her Emmett Till moment. That kind of visible rendering of Black people and the Black body as expendable and vulnerable, especially in the eyes and behavior of the state. And while such spectacles of violent death and vulnerability can come to define generations, we must remember the other factors that contribute to the vulnerability of young Black people. For example, the young Black adults, especially those from poor and working class communities that I'm asking us to center this afternoon, have lived with racial capitalism and the disinvestment in poor and urban areas, where living wage and low-skilled jobs have nearly become extinct, where too much of the housing stock has been battered and debilitated, where neighborhood schools have been neglected in lieu of charter and magnet schools, and where the Black middle class, William Jewis Wilson tells us, have exited, trying to guarantee their own survival, unless they have come back as gentrifiers, as Mary Patillo describes in her book, Black on the Block. With such devastation and despair, the neoliberal response has been to bracket, to isolate, to police, and incarcerate those people and areas constructed as dangerous and devastated. It's important to note that while neoliberalism has been committed to a kind of anti-statism rhetoric and policies, many forget that there are segments of the state that have grown under neoliberalism, segments such as the military, policing, and the prison industrial complex, producing what sociologist and Black feminist scholar Beth Ritchie calls our prison nation. These are some of the economic, political, and social conditions that face many young Black Americans. And so in many ways, it's not surprising that such attacks on Black people have generated yet another phase in the Black radical tradition, with young people through organizations such as BYP 100, the Dream Defenders, BLM, and more broadly, the Movement for Black Lives, taking to the street to demand recognition and accountability for their vulnerability relative in particular to the carceral state. Thus, the generative possibility of Black vulnerability is hard to deny. And while a generative vulnerability was clearly a driver of the collective action we all witnessed in the summer and fall of 2020, I know from my previous research that alienation is similarly an anchoring framework for the politics of young African Americans, serving as a major component of their political socialization and shaping their outlook. Political alienation, as conceptualized by political scientists such as David Easton and Jack Citron, is an outward-focused feeling toward or evaluation of the political. It is a declaration and belief in the failure, often of political institutions, from the Congress to the presidency to more generally the democracy. Vulnerability, I suggest, is different. It is an inward feeling or perception, real or imagined, that one or one's group can be and has been harmed with little ability for recourse or protection. And it is the combination or intersection of vulnerability and alienation, what I call a kind of alienated vulnerability, that describes and distinguishes the politics of Black young adults. An alienated vulnerability, at least in the political realm, is a feeling of political harm and anger with no sense that the institutions, systems, and/or agents, in this case the state, will protect you. In fact, the state and its agents may be the source of your harm. Hints of alienated vulnerability have emerged in the data that we've been collecting on young Black people through the Gen Forward survey. So I'm going to show you a few frequencies to illustrate what I mean, because I want the numbers to be accessible to all those joining us today. As a side note, if anybody wants to talk to me about some of the multivariate statistical analyses that we've pursued that show, in fact, that feelings of political vulnerability are often one, or in many cases, the most significant factor shaping how young Black people feel about the police or democratic ideals and effective means of change. Happy to talk with you about that once we have a glass of wine, okay? Okay, so let's start with the difference between formal citizenship and belonging. Specifically, when we ask young adults, do you feel like a full and equal citizen, majorities of all young people say yes. Remember that, they say yes. So this is not a totalizing theory here, they say yes. However, while majorities of all young adults say yes to that question, there is nearly a 30 percentage point difference between black and white young adults, with over 4 out of every 10 young black adults saying they do not feel like a full and equal citizen, given, however, that they have formal citizenship. Moreover, when we ask whether your racial group, in this case black people, are full and equal citizens in this country with all the rights and protections that other groups have, the numbers drop significantly, with just over 1/3 of young black adults believing that black people are full and equal citizens in this country. Now, one factor that research suggests shapes perceptions of political belonging is interactions with the state and its street-level bureaucrats. We know from the work of scholars such as political scientist Vesla Weaver, Amy Lerman, and Tracy Birch that such encounters for African-American young adults are often brutal, demeaning, and sometimes deadly, leading, as we would expect, to distrust and alienation. Thus, for young black Americans, it is often the domain of policing that most exemplifies their different and more vulnerable positioning relative to other young adults. For example, in nearly every Gen Forward survey, since we launched in 2016, we have asked the question, what is the most important problem facing this country today? And I would say in at least 85 to 90% of those surveys, young black Americans always name racism and also often include police brutality. And in this case, you can see even during a pandemic. So while other young people are saying it's COVID, young black people are saying it's racism. African-American young adults are also more likely than other respondents to believe that police harassment and brutality are extremely or very important issues in their communities. They believe that the police treat black people worse than white people, and that the killing of black people by the police is an extremely or very serious problem. Something I always just want to point out that we have even more data than this, but it really wasn't until I think the fall of 2020, August of 2020, when we saw for the first time a majority of young whites agreeing that, in fact, the killing of black people by the police was an extremely or very serious problem. Now, in response to the harm coming from the state, African-American young adults signal strong support for protest organizations like Black Lives Matter and the Movement for Black Lives, while they correspondingly register a significant skepticism that the fundamentals of the political system, like the Constitution, are fair, and that presumed cherished principles such as free speech should hold the idealized position that they do in our national narrative. And I would just point out the way African-American and young white adults kind of mirror each other, but in terms of opposite agreement on this question. Now, however, beyond the attitudes towards the police, we also find that the political vulnerability of young black adults is possibly shaping the knowledge about democracy they prioritize. We know, for example, from the literature and political science that most measures of political knowledge align with what is considered to be the liberal state. Here I'm referring to questions that ask how many justices are on the Supreme Court, a very important question right now. Who is the president and vice president? And which of the two political parties is more conservative? When one measures political knowledge through questions meant to measure one's understanding of the liberal state, scholars arrive at the consistent finding that young white Americans have more political knowledge than African American and Latinx young people. Our Gen Forward team decided to test the finding of racial differences in political knowledge by fielding a survey with different measures of political knowledge. This time, we fielded a survey with indicators more closely aligned with knowledge about the carceral state. Specifically, we asked respondents to match the names of victims of police brutality with the conditions of that experience. As we expected, when we focus on the carceral state, young black Americans exhibited higher levels of what we will call political knowledge. Political scientist Marcus Pryor, in his work on political knowledge, argues that people seek out and retain the political information or knowledge that is most pertinent to their lived condition. Thus, when we center young Black Americans as our normative democratic subject, what comes into view is not the liberal, but in fact the carceral state, challenging any promise of full democratic inclusion. Okay, finally, I want to briefly say that when we center young Black adults as our democratic subjects, it also alters how we understand the levers of change. Specifically, when we ask our respondents the best way to make racial progress in the United States, nearly 1 out of every 5 Black young adults say revolution. You should, don't get scared, okay. You should also note that our African-American respondents are the only group where some form of voting, local or state, does not appear in their top 3 selections. Now, I recognize that many will argue that these young people have no idea what revolution is and entails. Trust me, I've heard this argument. That, in fact, might be true. But I believe that what these young people are saying very clearly is that they do not believe that traditional avenues of change in this vulnerable democracy can address the systemic anti-Blackness that shapes their lives. They do not believe that the cherished guardrails can effectively challenge the afterlife of slavery. And if we go back to their embrace of the idea of revolution, a weighted and complicated and contested term, to be sure, but one that we could say is full of, at times, hope and expectation. The optimist in me sees their alienated vulnerability as having the potential to be generative, to say not only that existing systems and institutions are not working for us, but also that we will find the courage and vision to transform those institutions. Okay, let me make a few concluding comments, ending where I began with Du Bois. But this time my focus is on his writings in Black Reconstruction, specifically on abolition democracy. For Du Bois, it is through the lives of newly emancipated African Americans that we come to understand what is needed for the nation and specifically what is needed for democracy, namely abolition democracy. By abolition democracy, Du Bois means the building of new institutions, new practices, new social relations that would have afforded freed Black people the economic, political, and social capital to live as equal members of society, to hold power and shape and realize a true democracy. Specifically, Du Bois writes, abolition democracy demands for Negroes physical freedom, civil rights, economic opportunity and education, and the right to vote as a matter of sheer human justice and right. Thus, Du Bois has reframed the question from what does it feel like to be a problem to are we able to see newly freed Black Americans as our way forward in this vulnerable democracy. Now, of course, this afternoon I've tried to detail the fully reimagined democratic project of abolition democracy that has yet to be realized. However, it is possible that in the political vulnerability of young Black Americans and, emphasis on and, the political vulnerability of U.S. democracy, that we can find new ways for imagining and building the abolition democracy that Du Bois details and calls for. One last point. Du Bois goes on to write that, and I quote, "The real frontal attack on Reconstruction, as interpreted by the leaders of national thought in 1870 and for some time thereafter, came from universities. Thus, at a moment," end quote. "Thus, at a moment of possibility where newly freed Black people who had suffered and been made vulnerable could help to remake the country and specifically the democracy, it was in part the university and the racist theories coming out of universities that dimmed the light on the possibility of a multiracial democracy based on equality. So I guess I would ask us this evening, those of us attached to universities, what are we doing to facilitate the imagining and building of the abolition democracy that not only Du Bois fought for, but that young Black Americans fight for today? When we think about the young Black people who are killed, sadly, almost daily, too often blocks from this and other universities, what are we doing? When we think about the 30-year death gap in life expectancy between young Black adults who live on the south and west sides of the city and those young white adults who live on the north side in predominantly white neighborhoods, what is our responsibility? And when we think about the wealth that has been extracted from communities surrounding not only this university, but so many others, namely Harvard, right? We might ask, what do we owe? I suggest that we start to answer these questions by centering the young people in Woodlawn, in Inglewood, and Washington Park as our normative and democratic subjects. I think through their lives, we can see a generative vulnerability. Thank you. Sit down. Sit down. All right, thanks. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, we have a question? Questions? I think I said it all. There's nothing to be there. Oh. Yes, sir. Thank you. I think they want you to. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah,
so
I'm
everyone
Walter.
else
My
knows
name.
who you are?
My name's Walter Massey. Then the just know. Well, that was just fantastic.
Thank you.
But, not but.
And
Are there political implications for political strategies? Since we see voting is not really rated that highly among these young people, how do we translate these findings into a strategy that will also add political power? Because I'm a person who believes that political power is part of the strategy
Absolutely.
of obtaining equal rights.
Thank you. That's a great question. And I would say that I have had the opportunity to work with and talk with, in particular, young activists, and I think they would say, they would deny the fact that they need me to kind of develop a strategy. In fact, I'm learning from their strategy. They understand the significance of the vote and thus radicalize their thinking about the vote through, for example, an electoral justice project. So not just voting for the least distasteful politician, but to think about agendas that they can advance that really would lead to kind of transformative change, to run their own candidates or candidates that come out of movement, Cori Bush, for example, who will be responsive to and accountable to folks in movement spaces. But I think the other thing they would say is that we have to have a kind of, and I don't want to talk for them, I would say that we have to have a broad view of what does it mean to shift power. And we have been saying over and over again, if we could just receive, just build, electoral strength, somehow that would change things. And I think what we see in the data is young people saying, enough is enough, right? That the strategies, in fact, that were developed in the 1960s with the Voting Rights Act, right? The election of Black public officials and Black politicians have not truly shifted the experiences and the life of young Black people, right? We've elected Black officials at the same time that we saw the building of the carceral state. And so demographic representation is not going to save or shift the power that young people want. So I think they are demanding different strategies, right? They are saying, in fact, it is, yes, okay to think about revolution or to think about strategies that truly do shift how we understand governance, how we understand, the nature of power. I should have there's another slide up there, for example, where we ask a question about favorability, and it's about capitalism and socialism. Again, people will say, oh, they don't know what they're doing, but there's less favorability for capitalism, and there's more favorability for socialism, right? I think they are in a space of saying it is time to reimagine our commitments. It is time to reimagine how we govern. It is time to reimagine the economy and to produce, in fact, structures that are meant to truly provide people with equality and the things that they need to survive and to thrive. And I think that's their focus in terms of thinking about politics at this moment. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Time for one more question.
No, I think she's taking it up there. Okay. Sorry.
Oh, hi, Professor.
Hello, how are you?
I'm okay. I'm Watson Lubin. In the past 2 days, of course, we've gotten news out of the Supreme Court because of that Politico article. And I was wondering, because there's always this incessant centering of white women on Twitter, I was wondering, as per your analysis, if you could center Black Americans and what your analysis might bring to bear with respect to how Black people in this country consider their own autonomy with respect to reproductive freedom. That's all.
We just asked questions about, for example, I'm trying to think of, there were a series of questions. It was about both the attacks on transgendered female athletes, the no talk about gay in, what is it, I think K through, yeah, I knew it was Florida, but I was trying, that's right. Thank you. We could do this collectively. I like that idea. And I think what we see are kind of mixed results, right? There was real support, for example, among African-American respondents in terms of reproductive justice and protecting reproductive justice and opposing, for example, the Texas law on abortion. There was less clarity, and that's my generous term, about the issues around trans athletes and not talking about gay in K through 12 in Florida, right? So I don't want to represent all Black communities or all young Black people as, in fact, radical or progressive. In fact, we know that what has been amazing about, for example, the Movement for Black Lives are the ways in which these organizations understand that they have to organize in Black communities. They don't assume anything. They take young Black people where they are and move them in a direction based on their lived experience. So is the question, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, I'm giving you data, but say the question again, maybe I'll give you a better answer. Is that good enough?
Oh, well.
Chicago.
I'm so sorry, Professor. I don't
That's
mean to be so cheeky. But I was hoping if we were to center Black African Americans in this country, what sort of thoughts might they have about the situation? Of course, what you provided so far has given us some sense that, yes, there's some vague generality about the ways that Black people feel about this particular issue. Mm-hmm. But I figured with it being such a hot-button issue, not one that could be so easily lent to memification. I mean, this is a very serious issue. I was wondering what your data might tell us.
Right. Well, so I think the first thing I would say that the data tells us, and I'm not on Twitter, so I don't know what is being said. I can only imagine. But I think what the data tells us is that it's hard to say what Black people will think on this issue, right? That there is a complexity and different positions on this issue. I think the other thing, though, that we can say is that there will be skepticism among Black people that the state has any right or any insights about the control of people's bodies, in particular, in this case, women's bodies and their reproductive justice. The third thing I would say, though, is that I think Black people and Black women and Black feminists will be skeptical of white women and white feminists defining this issue in such a way that it truly impacts everybody's body, and we're, focused on concern. So if we're truly committed to, in fact, reproductive justice and reproductive freedom, it doesn't mean just, protecting Roe v. Wade. It means, in fact, ensuring that women who need assistance federal assistance to get an abortion are able to get that federal assistance, right? So it's understanding the intersectional positionality of women through race, through class, through sexuality that I think Black people and Black feminists in particular, I'm going to shift to Black feminists, would demand of us in terms of our analysis of this issue at this moment. Okay.
I was just told we have a time for one or two more questions, so if there
You
are.
switched on me. Okay, all right. That's all right.
We have a question up here.
Oh, okay.
Hi, Kathy.
Hi, Jerry.
Thank you so much for that. It really changes my thinking about where to center challenges to democracy. I'm going to ask you the question you get all the time about class.
Yeah.
Let's say you went back to Toledo,
Yes.
where we know there are devastated working class communities that are white.
Yes.
We know about the opioid crisis.
Yes.
Maybe this is simply the multivariate question you wanted to put off to wine, but what would your study look like there and how would it differ?
Jerry, Jerry is do I call you you'll always be my colleague, but yes. So as part of this book project, we are, in fact, I'm looking at what we're calling white vulnerability tenderly, right? And I will say two things about that exploration. One is that it's, of course, complicated, right? In the sense of there is devastation of white communities in Toledo, Ohio. But there is also, as Du Bois and Roediger and others have told us, an attachment to the wages, to the benefits, to the power that comes with whiteness. And so I think when colleagues have heard me talk about this work, there is a way in which people feel uncomfortable labeling young white people in particular who have access to a different type of kind of power within the racial order, labeling them vulnerable. Now, I want to make the case, in fact, that what we have to do is have a nuanced understanding of their positioning, and that, in fact, we have to pay attention to the changing economic structure, to, deaths of despair, and to say that there is real vulnerability there, at the same time that there is access, right, to a kind of positionality close to whiteness on a racial hierarchy. And how do we, and I think this is my responsibility in the work, tell a nuanced story about both so I often say that what we see among young Black people is a vulnerability through the lived experience of, brutality, of seeing other Black people killed. For young whites, what they're holding on to is a narrative about who they should be and what they should have access to, even though they have never lived that necessarily, right? And that is a different type of vulnerability to make an intervention in. But I do think as we kind of think through the idea of political vulnerability, I want to think through both of those positions, right? Because I actually think, and this is, that there is a way in which if we can think about kind of vulnerability in white communities, are we, and I know we always are asking this question, are we able to leverage that into a kind of position of political solidarity, which is always what we're hoping for, right? Yeah. Okay. Last question? Okay.
Yes. Dennis Keller, how does educational success, especially K-12 and especially usefulness, depth of education, figure in the issues you've been covering with us? Right.
That's an interesting question. So we would think that education would have an impact. And what's really striking in our data is that when we control for any number of factors, income, education, that those issues actually aren't as significant as we would hope, as we might expect them to be. Meaning that even young Black people who have had access and acquired what we consider to be higher levels of formal education still understand themselves to be alienated, still understand themselves to be vulnerable. Now, in part, that is because of their attachment to communities that are vulnerable and are alienated. In part, it's because, in fact, that even in places like the University of Chicago, where, in fact, you would expect people that have access to this to feel comfortable, they don't. They feel like they're outliers, right? I joked about the anxiety I had in giving this talk, but it was also an anxiety about never fully feeling like I am of the University of Chicago. And you could say, how can that be? You've had all these positions. But I think there is a way in which alienation is systemic, right? And it's not just your positionality. Remember the slide that we ask about people's attachment to their group. Do you believe that Black people, right, that matter in terms of linked fate and linked vulnerability, are full and equal citizens? And I suspect that most Black people would say no to that question. So I think individual education probably has an impact on some of these DVs, on some of the dependent variables, but actually over and over again we see that it doesn't, that it even for young people who've had access to higher levels of formal education, they still feel alienated and vulnerable.